Well, I'm Carol Mickett, and welcome to our town. And this starts the 2013 Our Town year. And the beginning of every season, I seem to have, and I guess it's planned, someone from the Tampa Bay Times, although the first person was from the St. Pete Times. Mr. Andy Barnes was the first guest of our town.
You can still call it the St. Pete Times. Yeah. We'll take that.
So, Our Town is a series about discovering the identity of St. Pete, and in general, discovering how you find the identity of a city, a place where we live, our home, our community. And we've investigated that with many guests, most of them people who have lived here for a long time and have contributed their hard work and vision to creating St. Pete, and telling us about their memories and their vision for our town. Of late, I've started to have younger people and people who are creating the city now based on the foundation that's been established over the decades. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted Eric to be my guest is because one of the ways the identity of a city gets formed is by people going away and representing our town. So Eric, of course, writes for our paper, which gets read by many people throughout our country and other countries. But he's also on NPR, and he's on Fox, and he's on MSNBC, and he does things for ESPN and sports, and which is interesting. And he talks about media and all sorts of things. And of late, he's been really talking about being a spokesperson for issues about race. And he has a new book out called Racebaiter, in which he talks about the issue of race in the media, and we'll talk about that a bit. And you can indeed purchase that book outside, if you so desire, after the event. So with that, please let us all welcome Eric Deggans. So
this feels like inside the actor's studio or something.
Good. And what is your favorite word? The first question.
Can't repeat it in polite company. Anyway.
The first question I always ask everybody is how you came to St. Pete.
Sure. Well, I came to St. Pete for a job. I came to St. Pete to work at the St. Petersburg Times. The job of the pop music critic had come open, and it was, funnily enough,
the pop music
critic. Yeah, Sean Daly does that job now. And it was interesting. I had met the previous pop music critic, Tony Green. Some of you may know him. He teaches special needs kids in the school system now. And I had met him at a convention a few months before he left the job, and had sort of talked to him about St. Petersburg and about working for the paper. And he was very encouraging and said, you know, you should go for it. You know, you should try to come down. And I was actually recommended for the job by someone from the Florida Times Union who was trying to get me to come there. I was working for a paper in New Jersey, and I sort of told him, you know, your paper's kind of the same size as my paper. It's at that time I think it was the 4th largest paper in the state. You know, I'm not really looking to go through a move like that to move laterally. And he said, well, you know, the best paper in the state is the St. Petersburg Times, so you should think about working there. So it worked out, and when I got to the Times, you know, I studied journalism at Indiana University. I'm from Indiana. Yeah, all right. And so you may or may not know, but there's a huge cadre of Indiana University alums who work at the St. Pete Times. They call us the Bloomington Mafia. And,
well, Andy Barnes had a relationship.
Yeah, Andy Barnes had a relationship. Paul Tash went to Indiana University. My boss, the deputy managing editor of the paper, went to Indiana University. The Metro editor went to Indiana University. When I came to the St. Petersburg Times, the features editor went to Indiana University, and the deputy features editor was David Letterman's sister, who also went to Indiana University. So, so there's a lot of folks from Bloomington I felt right at home. In fact, the Metro editor for the paper was the managing editor of the newspaper at Indiana University when I was in school there. So, so it just felt like a perfect fit. You know, they knew my work. I felt comfortable with them. And after about 13 months, I transitioned into doing television.
So what were your credentials to be a pop music
critic? I know. Well, number one, I've been a musician for a long time. I'm a drummer and a bassist. I've been playing drums for 33 years.
And were you in a band and things like that?
I was in a band in college. It was called the Voyage Band. We got signed to Motown. We did a record in Chicago for them. We toured Japan and throughout the Midwest and had a single that did real well on radio.
What was the single called?
It was called Strange Situation.
Can you hum a little bit of it?
It's a strange situation when you love someone that doesn't love you. So,
Yay!
it's actually on YouTube. It's actually on YouTube if you're so inclined.
Okay,
to look
what
it up.
it's called again?
It's called Strange Situation.
Strange Situation.
And,
YouTube.
Yeah,
okay.
it's on YouTube. So we got signed by Motown and sort of did that whole. I took 2 years off from school and did that whole thing. And
before you graduated.
Before I graduated.
And then you went back.
In fact, I finished my last credits for college by correspondence from Osaka, Japan, while I was playing in a club there. And you know, so I decided to become a journalist.
So was that really fun, being in a band?
Well, the time that you're on stage is amazing. The 2.5 hours that you're on stage, or the 4 hours that you're on stage. In that case, it was 6 hours. We would play 45 minutes on and 45 minutes off for 6 sets in Osaka. We started 6 in the afternoon. We started 6 in the evening and end past midnight. So that is wonderful. But a lot about being a musician is sitting around and waiting, or it's a ruthless business. You know, it's a ruthless business. People have competing agendas. They'll turn their backs on you in a minute. There's a lot of downtime. And I just decided that it wasn't occupying my mind enough. It wasn't intellectual enough. And I'm not a schooled musician. I don't read music that well. I'm not very technically trained. So I wouldn't be able to get a job, for example, teaching in a college or something like that, like some of my friends have. So everybody in the band moved to LA but me, and I moved to Pittsburgh to start working for a newspaper. And the other people that I've worked with, the lead singer in that band is Burt Bacharach's top background vocalist. She hires all the other ones and organizes them. The guitar player in that band has produced Babyface and Leanne Rimes and is now working with this guy named Charlie Wilson, who's a well-known R&B player. And the other guys have played with LL Cool J, Atlantic Star, Earth, Wind & Fire, all these amazing bands. So they have gone on.
And you play with the St. Pete Times.
I play with the St. Pete Times, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. So
do you play now?
I do. I still play around town. Every so often I'm at Krabby's in Clearwater Beach with a blues band. So I decided a long time ago that I'm a musician, that's part of my identity. So I always keep my abilities up. I always practice.
Do you have your drum set up at home?
I do. I have a shed next to my house where my drums are set up. So I always make sure that I have those abilities. I also play bass. I've been playing that for 15 years, bass guitar, and I sing. So I always make sure that I'm ready to play gigs because I feel like I have this talent, and it would be a waste to not use it.
So has that helped you when you became a music critic? So all of your knowledge about how the industry works and how music works?
It did help quite a bit in some ways. Like, in terms of understanding music, what I tell people is that musicians kind of hear music differently than civilians do. So as a writer, I saw music differently. It didn't mean I saw it better. I just saw it differently. For example, I'm much less focused on lyrics than a lot of pop music writers were. And they would talk about how great the lyrics were in a song. But to me, I was more concerned about how the song fit together, how the parts fit together, whether the musicians were playing well, whether the vocals were in tune, and things like that. I have a real hard time with artists who don't sing well, for example. So as much as I respect Bruce Springsteen, I'm not a huge fan because he's not the greatest singer. And as much as I respect Bob Dylan, as much as I respect Leonard Cohen, as much as I respect some of those guys, Lou Reed, I respect their work a lot, but I don't have a lot of their, I don't listen to a lot of their work because they can't sing. And so it's gotta be honest.
Although I think part of the point with those people is that they can't sing. Right?
Sure, but like I said, that's how a musician approaches it. You know, if somebody is singing a song and they're consistently flat, you just, I can't listen to that. You know, so when I first moved here, there were 3 local bands that had record deals, that had major label record deals. One was called P-Shine, one was called the Hazies, and the other was called Sugar Spoon. And when I got to know each one of those bands, I could see that they were where my band was right before we got dropped by Motown. So I knew that in 6 months they were all not going to have record deals. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So as a journalist, as a music journalist, being a musician did help because I could see patterns. I could see how people get treated by their record companies, who comes to visit them, you know, how their record gets released, where they get to tour. You know, I could tell what their fate might be, you know. And it was an amazing treat. You know, when I was in New Jersey.
And you were in Asbury Park.
I was I worked for the Asbury Park Press. So
Bruce Springsteen country.
So you know, I hung out with John Bon Jovi. I interviewed Bruce Springsteen 3 times. I hung out with Smithereens. You know, a lot of musicians live in that town. So I saw a lot of that up close.
So when you moved from being a music critic, I mean, you're a pop music critic as opposed to the classical, which John Fleming does.
Classical and jazz I didn't write about very much, but I wrote about everything else.
And then you moved to TV, and then did that include radio and print? Because now you write about all media.
Yeah, now I write about it all. Well, at the time, we had somebody who sort of wrote a little bit about radio, so I didn't worry about radio as much. I mean, it was kind of interesting because I was pop music critic, and I was at this huge music convention in New York, and a bunch of Florida people had congregated at a bar where we were watching Marilyn Manson, this rock band play from Fort Lauderdale originally. And so I looked around, and I said to myself, okay, I'm going to factor out the fetuses, right? So I'm going to factor out anybody who's 25 or younger. I'm not even going to worry about that. Right? So you factor out the fetuses.
Were you in the 25 and under group?
No, at that time I was.
What, in the 30 and under group?
31, 32, something like that.
Old.
You know. So I said I factor out the fetuses, and then I'll look around and say, who is married and has kids? And I was the only one. And so I said to myself, you know, this is not a job that's conducive to having a family. I felt like if I wasn't out in the clubs 3 or 4 nights a week, I wasn't doing my job. And so I wanted to do something different, and I wanted to have a job where I could write about a lot of different things in life. You know, you can do that with music, but in television touches everything. Everything happens on television. And this was before the incredible explosion of television that we have now, where, you know, television's on your smartphone, you know, television's on your iPad. You know, television reaches you in every corner of your life, even if you don't want it to. And, right? So, but I could tell that's where it was going. So I figured being a TV critic is something that would allow me to write more adult things, and I wouldn't feel pressured to keep up with pop music in a way. There's very few pop music critics who can do the job when they're in their 50s and their 60s and still be good at it. There are a few, but I wasn't sure I was that person.
So how did you approach the Times and say, I'd like to do
No,
this?
I was sort of thinking these thoughts, you know, these were things that would just, because what's interesting about journalism now is that now there's no clear path, you know. It's hard to know how to advance your career in today's journalism world because so many journalism outlets have been disrupted. But back then.
What do you mean by a journalism outlet? You mean
I mean
like
newspaper, television, radio. you know, there was a process to having a successful journalism, newspaper journalism career when I started. You would move around a lot and probably work at 3 or 4 newspapers of ascending quality until you reach one that was really good. And then you just work like heck at that one to try and advance up the ladder, and until you got into a job that was sort of your end goal, you know. For me, I don't know how many of you guys read Clarence Page, for example, from the Chicago Tribune.
Sure.
But he's an editorial writer who also has a column, and I always thought of myself as like that kind of writer. At some point, I would reach
Well,
that.
he's a good model.
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
wonderful.
he's amazing. And so, so when I was making these choices about whether I was going to be a TV critic or not, I was sort of figuring out what my career path was going to be. And it seemed I could do TV for a while, and I could write about a lot of different things. And then if I decided to make the transition to writing about more serious things, I could do that. And eventually I did. I joined the paper's editorial board.
And you had a nice editorial in Sunday's Perspective this past
Sunday.
Sunday.
Right. Now I'm to the point where I can write about non-TV things, and they let me do it. So I was thinking these things, and then the TV critic then, her name was Monica Yant, who was also a friend, told me that she was moving to Philadelphia to take a job there. And then I realized, okay, you know, I can transition out of television and do something that lets me write about more things. So I applied for that job, and they hired me because, you know, it's cheap. You know, just
so what
just change the name on the business
actually
cards.
is the purpose of a media critic? Why do we want a media critic?
Sure. Well, you know, media is filled with messages. Media is filled with messages that transmit values. The way they sell you something is they show you something that evokes a feeling, and usually it's attached to a value, right? So
can you give an example?
Sure. If there's a commercial, well, you know, I have a story running tomorrow about the Super Bowl commercials, and the Super Bowl commercials that get the most traction usually star a kid or a dog or sex or celebrities. Why? Because those are the things that people pay attention to, right? And people with kids and dogs, especially kids and animals, will they'll connect with those figures in a commercial more quickly and with less skepticism than they will with an adult, right? So if you have a kid in a commercial doing something cute, you know, a lot of people will just instantly connect with that because you've either been a kid or you've had a kid, or you know somebody who has a kid.
I think we've all been kids.
We can all relate to that. Well, but for some of us, being a kid is not such a great memory. But I just mean you know, it's relatable in a way that a lot of other things are not, right? So so when you see an ad with an animal in it in the Super Bowl, for example, you'll get the message that dogs are cute.
Dogs are cute.
Nobody would, or few people would dispute that. But that is a value message, or that kids, when kids act like they're wise beyond their years, that's funny, you know. As a parent, I got to tell you, one of my big pet peeves is these commercials where the kids run a house, and the parents act like they can't tell the kids anything, you know. How can we fool them into eating grape nuts?
Yeah, right.
You put the grape nuts in a bowl and you tell them to eat it. that's how you get them to eat them. So that's a pet peeve pet peeve of mine, and that to me is a value is a value construct that in a weird way kind of gets passed along in some commercials. So, but there are other value systems, value constructs that are
And
passed
why
along
do we
that are
want to
more.
know that?
Because you want to be smart consumers. Why do you want to know how many calories there are on a Big Mac? Why do you want to know? Well, yeah. If you're eating them, you don't want to know. Why do you want to know what ingredients there are on a hot dog? You know, if you care about consuming healthy things, then you want to know what's in your food. And you want to make the conscious choice. Hey, I know a Big Mac's awful for me, but I only have one every 6 months or something. You know, you can make a conscious choice knowing what impact it's going to have on your system. And I feel like media is like that too. I want people to make conscious choices about media. I don't want people to be pawns of media. The folks who create TV commercials and radio commercials and even put ads in newspapers, would love it if you didn't care what those messages were and you just responded to them. Mm-hmm. You just reacted. They would love that. But if you're going to be smart consumers, you got to know how the media is affecting you, how it's trying to manipulate you, what it's telling you, what it's not telling you, and why. And you know, my book, Racebaiter, is about a lot of prejudice that's embedded in media. Mm-hmm. And the only way to really get at it is to observe it first, to recognize it. It's the act of sort of removing it from the edges of our consciousness and making it something that you can consider full-on consciously.
You know, one of the things that's interesting about this whole subject we're talking about is that we spend a lot of our time viewing media.
Sure.
Listening to the radio, watching TV, reading the paper, being on the internet, and so on. And yet, we really don't have very many media critics.
No.
And when you look at the newspaper, for example, when we read Eric's columns and his articles, they're on the second page of the local section. So in terms of, you know, where it stands, it's not on the front page. But when you think about what you've just said and the how much we have this bombarding us all the time, sometimes at a choice, sometimes not, it would seem that discussion about this seems pretty important.
Yeah, you would think, you know. Mm-hmm. But again, you know, a lot of media outlets would prefer you don't think about it, you know. So I think that's part of it. And part of it, too, is that I found that there's a substantial number of people, but by no means a majority of people, who care to think about this stuff. I think a lot of people would prefer to just turn on the TV and just zone out and not think about it. You know, just like a lot of people would prefer to go to McDonald's and not think about what it's doing to them. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that Eric, in addition to writing for the newspaper, has a blog where he writes extra articles. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you've written about recently is this whole gun debate.
Right.
And one of the things that you mentioned was that in terms of talking about the media and violence, that a lot of the TV channels don't want to say that violence influences people in shows. But yet, as you point out, interestingly, they take advertising very seriously, and advertising is something that's supposed to influence us. So if advertising is supposed to influence us, why doesn't a program influence us?
Yeah, exactly.
So that sort of discussion seems to me to be very fascinating. Now, is that something that you've had further discussion about?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting situation because the jury's kind of out on whether observing violence in TV shows and fictional TV shows pushes somebody to be violent in real life. Mm-hmm. There are some experts who absolutely believe that, and there are some experts who feel that even in your subconscious mind, you distinguish between fictional situations and real situations, mm-hmm. and that you're not traumatized by seeing a fake death the mm-hmm. same way you would be if you saw it actually shown, if you saw a film of someone actually being killed, or if you actually watched someone being killed. But it's an interesting situation because as a TV critic, a lot of my job is saying, hey, this stuff affects you in ways that you don't understand or think about or consider, in ways that are subconscious. So it would be hypocritical for me to say, I love Sons of Anarchy, I love Justified, I love all these violent shows, so I don't think they affect you negatively because I like them. You know,
right?
That wouldn't be fair. And there's TV is a $9 billion a year business, and most of its money is earned by putting on these commercials with these value messages in them that I told you about, and they push you not only to buy specific things, but to feel certain ways about certain things. You're supposed to enjoy some things. You're supposed to not enjoy others. You're supposed to view some things as virtuous and laudatory, and other things are not. There's a whole set of value judgments that come in every commercial. And, I could put on a commercial and as every second passes, I could tell, okay, they're showing you that because they want you to feel this way. They're showing you this because they want you to feel this way. When you watch the ads in the Super Bowl, there isn't a millisecond that appears on the screen that hasn't been carefully considered and manipulated and presented to you in a certain way. And really, you should watch TV with that in your mind. Believe it or not, Honey Boo Boo is incredibly manipulated and contrived. And as much as we want to think they just put a camera in front of a crazy family.
Explain Honey Boo Boo.
Sure. I don't want to explain it, if I must. Well, TLC has this show called Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, which is a spinoff of a show called Toddlers and Tiaras that focuses on little kids, little girls mostly, who do beauty pageants, and the horrific mothers who push them into it. And Here Comes Honey Boo Boo focused on a specific toddler known as Honey Boo Boo. Honey Boo Boo Child is her nickname that her mom gave her. And her mom liked to give her what she called go-go juice, which is this weird combination of Mountain Dew and Red Bull and all this. Yeah. So she'll be up for the pageants, you know. But Honey Boo Boo, it focuses on the family. They live in rural Georgia.
So it's a reality show?
It's a reality show. And they subtitle when they talk to each other, they subtitle the dialogue as if I mean, you can understand what they're saying. You know, it's like the producers are saying, here's the joke. You know, these people have such a strange accent that we have to subtitle it for you. And it's an incredible, not only is it incredibly contrived, but the whole value system communicated by the show is that poor Southern people are eccentric and weird, and let's have fun looking at how much uncooler than us they are, you know. And they won't admit it. They say.
And is that a popular show?
Yes, it's very popular.
And who watches it? Is there is there a demographic? Do the people in the Northeast watch it to say that Southern people are?
I don't know. I don't think it's by region. Young viewers like it. I talk to people who say their kids watch it.
You mean like little ones watch it?
No. My kids.
Teenagers?
I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old in the house, and they'll watch it if I let them, which I don't. But, that is. I mean, they'll tape it on the DVR so they can watch it when I'm not in the room, because it's like, to me it was.
And have you ever asked them why they like it?
I think they enjoy that feeling of superiority. They enjoy watching these crazy people do this crazy stuff and sort of say, you get this little feeling of superiority, like I'm not that, If you've ever seen that show Cops, for example, that's another show where they show these working class folks, many of them drug addicts, many of them struggling with personal problems, getting arrested. Nobody middle class ends up on that show because they have lawyers who say, don't sign that release, So it's a cavalcade of poor people who don't have lawyers who are dumb enough to sign releases, and we get to watch it and feel like, hey, at least my life's not that bad, But
that cop show has been on for a long time.
It's been on for more than 20 years. Yeah.
So it must be successful, correct?
Oh, yeah. Well, success in TV is relative. Saturday nights, nobody watches television. Nobody in the target demographic that TV cares about. TV cares about viewers who are aged 18 to 49, right? So network TV. Local TV cares about people who are aged 25 to 54. They're a little older. But network TV and national TV outlets mostly care about viewers aged 18 to 49.
Because they think they'll buy things that are in the...
Because that's what advertisers want, So advertisers pay top dollar to reach that demographic. So on Saturday nights, that demographic is out. They're out doing stuff. So that's why you don't see hardly any original programming on the networks on Saturday night. It's all reruns. And Cops used to be on Saturday nights because it would get a relatively young audience, but it wasn't really like top shelf original programming that they were wasting on a Saturday night. So that's why it survived for so long. I did a story once about, they had an episode that was filmed in Tampa. This police officer who dressed like a clown and went around picking up prostitutes and prostitutes sting. Like he pretended he was a clown who was in between jobs, you know. They'd say, hey, I got a few minutes before I have to go to a party, you know, can we get together? And the women would come in, you know, and you could tell that they were women who were drug addicted and they were poor and they, you know, whatever. And so he would mess around with them a little bit, shoot some confetti in their face or whatever. And then when they asked for the money, they would bust them. And so I called the officer who was in the segment and I said, wow, you guys in the Tampa PD really dressed like that? And he's like, no, they gave us a costume. You know. So he said, normally I dress like a businessman. Normally I dress like a traveling salesman. So, so that's, you know, that's when I knew this stuff you see on reality TV is incredibly contrived. It's incredibly contrived. And as much as you go into these shows thinking, I know that it's contrived, I know it's set up, you don't know. You don't know how set up it is. You have to assume every moment that you see is scripted.
So
every moment.
One show that you do write a lot about is American Idol, which is a reality show of some sort. So how scripted is that?
Well, American Idol has several, like they have an interesting setup. They have it set up so that they can't really script parts of it. Because when the singer goes out, American Idol is a singing competition. And so when the singers go out on stage, either they produce or they don't, right? And once they have the live shows, viewers vote. So the viewers vote however they vote. But one of the things that's interesting, and I see this more with The Voice, which is NBC's singing show. The Voice is a singing show where celebrities pull together these teams of singers and then they pit them against each other until there's just two people left standing and then there's a final winner. And one of the things I noticed about The Voice is that when they would have the rounds where the singers would be competing against each other, the two singers would have to sing one song. And magically, the song would fit better one singer's voice rather than the other, right? So we had a singer from Clearwater, Juliet Sims, who went pretty far on The Voice, not the last cycle, but the cycle before it. And one of her first battle rounds, she's a real gutsy rock and roll singer, and they gave her a real gutsy rock and roll song. And the person she was singing against had a much lighter voice. And the song fit Juliet's voice like a glove, and it was totally awkward for the other singer. And you could tell the producers had kind of chosen a song that would fit the person they wanted to move forward on the show. And so, of course, American Idol won't admit any of this, but they have a lot of control over which songs the singers sing at any one time. They have a lot of control over what they wear. They have a dress rehearsal where they have a look that's put together by the show stylist. They go out, they sing sort of a rehearsal version of the song, and then the producer, Nigel Lithgow, tells them whether or not what they're wearing looks good. And he may say, I don't like that, you got to come up with something. Or get rid of that scarf, or change this or change that. Now, is he changing it because it looks bad, or is he changing it because he wants somebody else to do better, and you know, maybe this person looks too good? Who knows? You know, I mean, I'm sure he would deny that. But I'm just saying, there's lots of different ways producers can affect even a show where you would think it's as unscripted as a singer goes out and sings and the viewers vote. If they're handed a song that everybody knows they can't sing well, you know.
And why do you think that show has been so successful?
That show, I think, was successful because it's figured out a way to get young viewers energized and interested in the show. At first, it was new. Nobody had really seen a show like that in America, even though they'd done it in England. And there was a sense that it really was creating pop stars, the first couple of winners. And now I think it's reached a point where there's a whole cadre of really young girls, tweens and younger, who are watching the show and like to vote. And they're they're providing the ratings and they're controlling who wins.
And they always vote for that cute
They always vote for the cute, unassuming white guy.
That's right. So let's talk then. One of the things that you've been doing is talking a lot about race, and you've been thinking about that for a long time. So I think a lot of people have seen American Idol, and one of the objections is that now it is these young white preteens and teenagers who are voting, so that cute white guy always gets elected, and he's really not very good. I mean, he's okay, but he's not usually the best singer. Yeah. So
And there's been lots of discussion about that.
Sure.
And how the few African Americans that actually do get on usually get off, even though there's been some winners that have been black.
Yeah, I mean, the last cycle of the show was interesting in that the two runners-up were people of color. The runner-up was an Asian woman, and the third place finisher was a black man. So that was better. Normally, even, I think it was not that year, but the year before, so not last year, but 2 years ago, the first 5 people eliminated on American Idol were women of color.
Right.
You know, and so what's going on there. This last season in 2012 was not that bad. So at least they've made some progress.
So one of the responses to it is that, well, it depends on who's voting, and they can't get a black or people of color audience to vote, or maybe there is an audience, but they're not voting. So, why would that be? I mean, why would the show not be
Well, I think
attractive?
in a weird way it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, at least for black viewers tend to watch shows that feature black people prominently. You know, they want to see themselves represented. And so if American Idol had a long stretch where particularly if a black singer had an R&B kind of style, they would get kicked off really quick. And so after a while, you just start to say, well, why am I watching this? You know, the singers I like get kicked off, you know, early in the process, and somebody's going to win who is a style that I don't like that much. So you have fewer and fewer people of color watching the show, and so more and more of the people who win are not going to be people of color. It becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. And even the singers of color who are on the show sometimes have to change their style or disguise their style or make sure they don't get near R&B, because then they'll get kicked off. But again, one of the things that I thought was interesting about the last cycle is that the Asian American singer was a real R&B kind of diva. She was like a young Whitney, you know, and she did very well. She just had such a powerful voice.
She had a powerful voice.
People couldn't deny how good she was. And then the third place singer was an R&B and gospel singer raised in the church.
Right.
So
and he was really good.
And he did really well too. So, you know, I think there's some hope. And I think, again, you know, you talk about why do I write this book or talk about this stuff. Us TV critics constantly harping about how badly the American Idol was going for women and for people of color, I think affected the voters. I think they realized what they were doing because we kept writing about it. And so that may be part of it too.
Well, one of the things he said was, you know, people of color stopped watching American Idol because it wasn't about them. And I have to say that for me, I tend to watch TV shows that have strong women in them. Sure. So I liked Fringe because it had, you know, had a strong woman in it. I like The Good Wife. That's one of my favorites because it's about women. And it's always been that since I was a young girl, you know, to watch something that had a female. So that makes sense to me completely.
Oh, yeah, definitely. What's interesting, though, I think what the TV industry is struggling with right now is that Hispanics are becoming an ever-increasing part of that pie, and they don't know how to reach second and third generation Hispanics. By 2015, I talk about this in the book, by 2015, kids that are age 18 and younger are expected to be majority minority. You know, mostly Hispanic and Black and Asian. And Caucasians will be a minority in that group. Now, that group, as it starts to age and get into the 18 to 49 group that the advertisers care about, you know, their cultural norms, their cultural preferences are going to start to guide what the advertisers will pay for. And TV has not figured out how to reach, for example, young Hispanics who are second and third generation and have one foot in their family's home culture and one foot in America. And one of the things that's interesting to me about a Hispanic audience, for example, is that Univision or Telemundo or Spanish language network can reach them because the language is a unifier. Right. So they can put on telenovelas in Spanish, And you'll have Venezuelans watching, you'll have Puerto Ricans watching, you'll have Mexicans watching. They're all unified by the language. But when you start to present an English language show, and for example, there was a show called the George Lopez Show on ABC, starring George Lopez, a Mexican-American comic. Now, he's Mexican, his family's supposed to be Mexican, but his best friend, the actor who played his best friend, was Cuban, right? And I think the woman who played his wife was Puerto Rican, right? So if you're Hispanic and you're looking at the cast, you're saying to yourself, they're supposed to be a Mexican family, but she's Puerto Rican and he's Cuban, you know? And so you don't have the language unifying all those different cultures. So if you're Mexican, you might say, well, I want to watch George Lopez because I'm seeing somebody like me. But if you're Puerto Rican, you might say, well, why do I care about George Lopez? He's Mexican, you know? So I think they have to figure out a way. And part of it is that the culture, I think the culture is different for different Hispanics. You know, it's different depending on where you live in this country. It's different depending on how acclimated you are to American culture. Some people are very comfortable moving back and forth between those two. Some people just stay on one side or the other. It's going to be, it is going to be interesting to see media and big companies try to figure out how to target this group as it sort of moves through, you know, our society, the same way that baby boomers did.
Well, we all remember the Cosby Show, which was this, like, the most popular show for everybody.
Yeah.
And so here we had a show that really had this strong black cast, and it had spin-offs. So why don't that set a trend so that it would become now something that would be just normal? And now, for the most part, it's back to shows, at least with network, that are primarily white.
Yeah. Well, you can't clone Bill Cosby. You know?
But there's got to be, you know, more talented people than Bill Cosby.
Well, I mean, I tend to be cynical about this stuff. Number one, I don't think there's a lot of more talented people than Bill Cosby. He's amazing.
Yes, he is.
And I also think that it's hard to find somebody like Bill Cosby who appealed to a huge range of fans. White people liked him. Let's just be honest. White people liked Bill Cosby, but he was authentically black. So black people liked him too. He didn't. It wasn't like he had to change himself or mute his blackness to appeal to white people. And somehow he did that in the '60s, which that amazes me. That amazes me.
But
well,
not
so much I
Spy.
But
partly what happened was I grew up with Bill Cosby. I saw him in I Spy, then there were all those records and his.
Right.
And so he was just always part of the culture.
Yeah, but when you think about comics from that time, you think about Richard Pryor, you think about George Carlin, they each had a period where they tried to be conformists, and then they realized there's all this stuff happening that I have to talk about. And I can't do that wearing close cropped hair and a suit and tie and going on Mike Douglas, you know. So George Carlin grew out his hair and grew a beard and became more of a hippie. And Richard Pryor grew out his hair, stopped wearing suits, and started talking about, you know, his really, really tough childhood and the people that he knew when he was growing up. Bill Cosby was able to be authentically black, felt to black people like a real person who didn't pander, but at the same time was able to offer this unthreatening, welcoming vision to white audiences that they loved. And be entertaining and one of the funniest comics in the country on top of that. I mean, that's just like amazing. That's lightning striking, you know. And so part of the problem with another Cosby show is that there's not another Cosby. There just has not been another Cosby. And you know.
But what would someone like Richard Pryor say to that? I mean, I think Richard Pryor wouldn't want to be Bill Cosby.
No, he tried to be Bill Cosby, and it didn't work. He had to be himself. But I'm just saying that, you know, you think about Richard Pryor, and again, you know, to me, I really idolize what he did. I think he was really brilliant too. But you look at Richard Pryor, and you can see Richard Pryor leads to Eddie Murphy, leads to Chris Rock, leads to Kevin Hart. You could see that even though those guys are brilliant, they're part of a lineage, and they all kind of do the same thing for their generation, right? Bill Cosby kind of stands apart even from that.
Oh, that's really interesting.
There's nobody who's fused culture and comedic quality and showbiz ability the way he did. Maybe, like you think about Sammy Davis Jr., for example. That's somebody else who was really famous, but he always had this sort of weird relationship with the black community. People were never quite sure how to take him because he was too chummy with Republicans, and he was, he was too down. Well, come on now, if you're gonna be friends with Nixon in the '60s, when he's going around telling everybody, vote for me because the Democrats sold you out by signing the Civil Rights Act, people didn't quite know how to take, and down with the Rat Pack and all of that, some of the jokes that he used to go along with were, he would jump into Dean Martin's arms, and Dean would go, "I'd like to accept this award from the NAACP." Right. Some people thought that was funny. My mother hated that. She thought that was demeaning, and she couldn't understand why somebody like Sammy Davis Jr. would go along with that. Right. So even Sammy had this conflicted relationship with the black community sometimes that Bill Cosby didn't really seem to have. He avoided that. So all of that to say that they tried to figure out, Gregory Hines got a show, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, with Will Smith. He's the closest, really, but he's not a comic, he got a show. They, network TV tried to clone the Cosby Show, but there's just not another Bill Cosby. And so now we've reached a point where network TV isn't even trying. They do what I call the black best friend.
Well, that's the thing. I think that's the thing. Why isn't the network even trying?
Because those shows do, what happens is those shows, well, what seems to have happened, let me put it that way, because networks have tried. Number one, a lot of times those shows kind of suck. They don't do a great job pulling together those comedies. And then when you have an all-black comedy, white people assume, well, it's not for me. White people didn't assume that with the Cosby Show because it was Bill Cosby, right? But who else could do that? Maybe Will Smith could do that. Maybe one of the things too, and this has just occurred to me, but maybe one of the things too is that black actors who are popular enough to front a show like that are in movies.
That's right, like Denzel Washington.
Denzel, but he's not a comic. I can.
But he's a good
I don't know
actor.
if I can see the cat from Training Day, playing a dad in a sitcom.
But it could be a dramatic series.
Well, but see, TV has never really had successful. Network TV has never really had successful series starring a mostly black cast or a mostly non-white cast. One of the things that was interesting about Homicide: Life on the Street, for example, if you guys remember that show, I used to talk with occasionally the writers on that show, including David Simon, who used to be a police reporter from the Baltimore Sun, and they always felt like the show didn't get the viewership it deserved in part because even though it wasn't quote-unquote a black show, it was majority-minority. Most of the characters were black or Hispanic. There were really only one or two white characters on that show, and you had Andre Braugher and Yaphet Kotto, and you had some really great actors of color on that show, and even the people who were making it felt like viewers weren't watching it because maybe they assumed on some level that it wasn't for them. So I think that's the problem that you have with all minority casts, is that people who are, white people especially, might look at it and say, I don't think that's for me, or that's not intended for me.
So I'd like to change the topic a little bit. We don't have a lot of time left. So you've written this book called Racebaiter, which is a whole discussion about race and the way it's portrayed in the media. And you write about these issues a lot, about different things. You write about our president, and I wonder about your personal experience, so that you've chosen to do this. Sure. Not every black person who's a journalist chooses to be a spokesperson about race. So what about your personal life, your education, your experience, that has moved you into being such a spokesperson?
Well, that's a whole other.
Oh, yeah.
But
well,
I'll give you the
minutes.
Reader's Digest.
Okay.
So I grew up in Gary, Indiana, in an almost all black city. There's a small portion of it that has white people in it. But in my neighborhood, there was a high school that had, I don't know, like 1,200 kids. And as far as I know, there was one white kid in that school, right? So whenever we saw white people in our neighborhood, we assumed they were lost, right? We would go over and say, "You need some directions? You ain't supposed to be here." So until I was going into the 5th grade, I'd never really had any contact with white people other than going to McDonald's or a movie or something, having them hand me something.
And watching TV.
Well, watching TV, but I mean contacts. I might, somebody might serve me in a restaurant, but I didn't have any white friends. I hadn't really had a conversation even with a white person, beyond in a store or something. And then my mother was a teacher in the school system, and she knew the schools weren't that great. She decided to put me in a private school. So I went to a Jewish middle school.
And was this a private school then?
Yes, private school. So I go from a school where there are no white kids at all to a school where there are 3 black kids and everybody else is white.
And was that weird?
It was 5th grade, so it wasn't color so much as culture. So we came out of a showing of a video once, and I said, "Man, that was bad," and the kid looked at me and said, "Well, actually, I thought it was pretty good." I was just like, "Okay, I understand that." And so stuff like that would happen. When I was, I grew up in a rough neighborhood. By the time I was that age, I had seen 2 people shot already. And one was the brother of my best friend who lived next to me. He was killed by the cops at the end of my street, right? So,
and were the cops white, black, Hispanic?
They were black. He deserved it. He was a criminal, and he was running from them. He had a sawed-off shotgun. The other guy I saw get shot was a gang member. So it wasn't like these were. This was back in the day when people generally, in my neighborhood anyway, didn't get shot unless they were involved doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. It's not like today where you could just be hanging out on your porch and get a stray bullet. Right. People weren't that crazy yet. But I still had seen some pretty intense stuff. So I was hanging out with these kids who lived in suburbia, and they hadn't experienced any of that yet. But I had to learn how to deal with white people, right?
Now, did they have issues with you?
No, not really. Not that I knew of. One of the things that I noticed, here's what I learned. In my neighborhood, if you don't want to do something, you kind of just tell people you don't want to do something. White folks are polite about it. So you will go along with stuff that you really don't want to do.
That
because
is
it's the polite thing
true.
To do. Yeah. But resent the person who you feel like is putting you in the position where you have to do it. Right. And as a kid, I had to learn that, that I might say, "Hey, let's go to a movie," and this person I asked didn't really want to go to the movie, but they didn't want to say no either. Right. And that was something I didn't really understand. And then the other thing that would happen is it wasn't the kids, it was the parents. So the kids, so I'd get together with some friends at school, and we'd say, "Let's have a sleepover." And then all of a sudden, the day would just keep getting put off by the parents. So they didn't want me in their house.
What did your mom say to you about that?
The first couple times she wouldn't really. She'd just say, "Oh, whatever." And then after a while, she kind of broke it down to me. And that's fine, but it's weird to be good friends with somebody and feel like their parents are racists. Right, but I ran into that a fair amount. So, but what was good about that is that I learned how to deal with it when I was younger, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and then when I went to high school, I went to a Catholic high school. So,
world religions.
I mean, I gained an appreciation. Yeah. I knew what it was like to be in a situation where you were practicing somebody else's religious rituals out of respect. So at the Jewish middle school, I learned Hebrew. We had morning prayer services. We had Shabbat services every Friday. We celebrated all of the Jewish holidays, so we built a sukkah and all of that. And so I learned a lot about Jewish culture, And then
that's a wonderful thing.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
It was very valuable. And then when I went to the Catholic school, they had masses and Ash Wednesday and all of that, and we had priests and sisters who were teachers as well. So I experienced that. And you had faith classes. You had to take a class centered on the religion every semester. So I learned about Catholicism, and so I don't feel threatened by religion. I'm not particularly religious. But I'm happy to go into anybody's church and share in their fellowship and hang out and observe what they observe, do the same prayers that they do, and hang out with them and enjoy that companionship without feeling threatened by their faith.
So what's interesting is earlier on in our conversation, remember Eric was talking about being a musician, and he said it wasn't intellectual enough for me. And so
being a professional musician.
Right. So you wanted to do something like being a journalist where you could use
use my brain more and where I would be intellectually focused for more of my day.
And it makes sense, given how education was so valuable for your mom, that she got you into these schools. She instilled in you that this was very important. And I'm sure you did well.
Yeah, I tried to, and but the thing that was valuable for me for those two schools was that I learned how not only to deal with white culture, but how to define myself as a black person versus being submerged in white culture. So I went through, of course, a period where people might say, you acting white, or you're not really white because you start saying guys. That was a big thing in my neighborhood. After I was at that middle school for a while, I started using the word guys, which nobody said in my neighborhood. Why are you talking like that? You're talking like white people. And so I had to get to a point where I was comfortable with being the black man that I wanted to be, being black in a way that I felt was valid. And if somebody else thought that wasn't valid, that's their problem. But that's a journey, right? And so I reached that journey. So by the time I went to college, I sort of had it down. I figured out how to understand white people. I figured out how to understand my own culture and define myself. And I was ready for college. Now, unfortunately, I think a lot of my black friends who were in all black schools before they went to college had to make that transition then. And then you're paying big money, and you're trying to get trained for a career. And you're in this environment where maybe if you came from Gary, you went from a city where, if you went to that Roosevelt High School in my neighborhood, there was one white kid in that whole school. And then you go to Indiana University where black people are 10% of the student body. And your roommate might be white. And everybody on your floor in your dorm might be white. It's not so much the teachers, because that's kind of removed. It's more your living circumstances. You're in a totally unfamiliar environment, and you've got to get used to it when you're away from home and you don't have a support system, and you're changing in all these other ways as you change when you go to college anyway. And so I found a lot of my black friends would have trouble staying in college because they were struggling with all this extra stuff that maybe white kids didn't have to struggle with, because they were going to an environment where there was a lot of other people like that. And so I was glad that I made that transition when I was younger. And I could even try to help people out and say, hey, I think I kind of see what you're going through. Try to deal with it this way. Especially when I was on the school newspaper at IU, we had a lot of black reporters who would not be able to fit in with the cliques who were running the newspaper. And I would try to sort of school people on how to fit in, or how to manage folks so that they could get done what they wanted to get done without feeling ostracized, And so seeing all that, when I became a journalist, I just started writing about it.
Exactly. It makes complete sense that you wrote this book.
Totally.
Because it's exactly what you're saying. You're being a guide, and that's what you had to do growing up, and through all of this journey that you've had to come and write this book.
Totally.
So, Racebaiter. So we're almost out of time, but I can take one or two questions. Yes?
My name is John Rinaldi. Earlier you touched on toddlers and tiaras.
Yeah.
Do you find that as child abuse? As I see it that way.
I really, yeah, I would really, I don't know if it would be child abuse the way, you know, a legal definition of child abuse. I certainly would think it's not great parenting, you know, and not just for the obvious reasons. It's, you know, exposing a child to a situation where they become an international celebrity, and a good portion of those people see them as a buffoon. I just think that would be awful, you know. And Honey Boo Boo doesn't care now because she's too young to know what's happening to her. But when she gets older and she looks at that show and she sees how she was portrayed and how her family was portrayed, now maybe she'll be cool with it because they're going to make a ton of money. You know, if you look at one of the guys who was on this show, Storage Wars, filed a lawsuit against A&E, the company that makes this show. And he disclosed how much he expected to get paid in the next season of the show. He was going to earn $600,000. $400,000 in salary and $100,000 in bonuses. And then there's also a per diem that they get when they're in production. It was all going to total out to over $500,000, close to $600,000. And he is not the star of that show the way Honey Boo Boo and her family are the stars of that show. I would not be surprised if they're clearing $1 million a year now on that show. So of course, but see what's interesting is like, you know, they're a poor rural family living in rural Georgia. Now they've pretty much won the lottery, right? So how does the show survive when the family starts to have a salary of $1 million or $2 million or $3 million? That's what happened to Jersey Shore. All the kids got rich, so they couldn't keep doing it.
There's a gentleman in the back.
I know, it's crazy.
You talked about how the shows are tried and how there are all these messages that lead us astray, I guess, in the way who we really are. What, I guess, information could you share with us to maybe inoculate our audience and help us understand better how to avoid traps that the media presents to us?
Right.
So let me repeat the question.
Sure.
So the question is, what are tips to inoculate ourselves to not be manipulated?
Right, right. Well, yeah, the off button is one way. But I mean, not all messages are bad, right? I mean, every TV show is trying to entice you to watch them, and so when it leads up to the commercial break, there'll be kind of a cliffhanger to make sure that you want to come back in after the commercial break. And you know, they start some shows a minute before the hour or after the hour, so it makes it hard for you to tape on your DVR and stuff like that. You know, every show has its tricks. But the main thing that I tell people to do is just constantly ask yourself, why are they showing me this? You know, I mean, I think people have an instinct when they're watching a show that maybe has a message that they don't quite agree with or that they feel is kind of damaging or that they might be watching as a guilty pleasure, you know. I think about shows like Say Yes to the Dress. You know, my daughters love that show, Say Yes to the Dress. But I have a real problem with this sort of princess fantasy as being sold to women, right? To where there's going to be the perfect wedding and there's the perfect dress and you have to spend a crap load of money to achieve that. And oh, by the way, we have this whole series showcasing this store that can sell you all this stuff, you know. When the poorer people who come on the show are spending $2,000 on a dress. I mean, when I got married 21 years ago, that was the whole ceremony. We spent $2,000 on, right? These people are spending more than that on a dress. And so what I just tell people is that, you know, if you're watching Say Yes to the Dress and you feel a little uneasy, even though you enjoy the show, just keep asking yourself, why are they showing me this? You know, Storage Wars, one of the things that, Storage Wars is a reality show where these guys go in and, on these auctions where they auction off storage units that have not been claimed or paid for.
Who thinks up these things?
You know, who knows? Who knows? So there's this cast of like, you know, 4 or 5 people, and they all have their different quirks, and they go in, and you can look at the items that are in the storage unit. You can't go in or move anything or go inside the unit. You can just stand back and look, and then you decide if you want to bid on it. Well, I had seen a really interesting story in 60 Minutes about people falling into poverty from the middle class. And one of the things that happens is that both breadwinners lose their jobs, so they lose their house. So they take everything and they put it in a storage unit thinking things are going to get better, but they never do get better, and they fall behind on paying on the storage unit, and then the stuff gets auctioned off, right? So some of these units in storage wars may have come from people who, you know, lost everything in their homes because they put them in this storage unit that they can't pay for. Now, Storage Wars is not going to tell you that. Storage Wars is just going to say, hey, isn't it funny that they bought this storage unit, and you dig to the bottom of it and you find these collectible coins that are worth 20 grand. Well, who's going to not pay the rental fees on a storage unit that has collectible coins in it worth $20,000? Who's going to do that? Unless they're not able to, right? And as we find out in some of the allegations made from people who've been on the show, some of that stuff is set up. Some of that stuff is planted inside the unit. So, I mean, at least if you believe the allegations in the lawsuit that Dave Hester filed. So, so just ask yourself, you know, why are they showing me this? Particularly if you feel weird about it. Why are they showing me this? And is it really true? Are they manipulating me here? You know? And finally, you know, buy the book Racebaiter, because it has a lot of good information.
And at that note, we should say good night. And you should ask yourself if we've been manipulating you.
Not at all. What do you mean? I have no idea what you mean.
So thank you so much for coming. And next month, on February 28th, my guest is going to be Michael Maltson, who's the architect for The Lens. And he's coming in to be my guest. And we'll be talking about him as an architect and what he does and how he's developed his architectural vision. So that should be interesting.
Yeah.
So
I can't wait to hear the question and answers on that.
So let us again thank Eric Deggans for coming and read his columns.
All right.
Situation.